Professor Crandall is chair of the Department of Anthropology. He earned a bachelor's degree from BYU in 1986, then went to England in pursuit of advanced degrees. While at Oxford, he received his Master of Philosophy degree in 1989, and in 1993 was awarded his Doctor of Philosophy degree, also from Oxford, before returning to BYU. He has published widely in prestigious anthropology journals, and his robust intellectual example has been a great influence on many of his students, whom he has inspired to pursue careers in anthropology. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Professor David Crandall.
Thank you. I think as all titles of talks these days are teasers, so is this one. But the topic is of great interest to me. It's one I have studied through library research as well as my own field research, and I intend to give you my own idiosyncratic account of it. I feel I'm old enough to be able to do that. I can only cover this topic briefly, and I wish to do so by dividing it into three sections. I would like firstly to look at the anthropological history of savage thought. Then I would like to look at the basic structure of human thought, or human imaginary worlds. And as human imaginary worlds contain the ideas about the nature of reality that we accept as true, thirdly, I want to pursue the question, how do human beings come to know the things they think are true about the world to actually be true? If this seems like a dry topic, I apologize and invite you to quietly nap in these very comfortable seats. Modern anthropology was born in the mid-19th century, during the golden age of European colonialism. I think it's true that for the most part, the first Europeans to have sustained meaningful contact with natives were the missionaries. And during the 19th century, there was an unprecedented number of mission societies established throughout Europe and even in the United States. Missionaries had a very difficult time settling down in some society. They did not know the language or anything about the people, and they were there to save souls and also to figure out how to translate Christianity into a context so that it could be understood, and quite often to translate the scriptures into native languages. One of the things that missionaries were able to do was to discover that there are people in this world whose ideas about the nature of reality were very, very different from their own. Initially, I think many of them felt the ideas were incomprehensibly different. But over time, quite a number of missionaries actually prospered with languages. And for the most part, the languages of Africa were first recorded and for the first grammars and dictionaries put together by missionaries. It's also true that many mission societies established journals in which missionaries could record their experiences. Some of them were anecdotal, others were a bit more serious, but many of these things intrigued and delighted the readers of these journals. Now, intellectually and academically, the second half of the 19th century was dominated by various theories of evolution, which in time found their way into anthropology. The particular kind of evolution that found its way into social anthropology was a teleological version of it, that human beings were evolving toward something specific. And that happened to be Victorian Englishmen. Victorian England represented the absolute zenith of the history of mankind and the achievements of mankind. And so scales were put together of the various stages of advancing toward Victorian England. I suppose the first Uggs and grunts eventually found their way into savagery and eventually moved into barbarism and then found civilization. And these various words were also connected to technological developments. The real question then was, is the movement toward Victorian Englishmen unilinear or multilinear? Well, initially, most of the 19th century anthropologists felt it was unilinear. And so that if we went back and found the crudest, rudest societies possible, typically thought of as the Australian blackfellows, this would be how Englishmen really lived, worked, and thought thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. Well, reports of primitives that came back in travel literature as well as mission society journals often portrayed their worlds as bizarre. And this provoked questions. How do these savages actually think? As this question was investigated, it seemed to equate a simple society, meaning a fairly simple political structure, with simple minds. So questions of the origin of the idea of God and the soul, these sorts of questions particularly intrigued the Germans. And they indulged in what we would call, if I were a horse, theorizing. How would any rude, crude savage hit upon the idea that there might be a God? Well, according to some of these German schools of thought, there might be some savage out there who is party to a thunderstorm and hears these enormous claps of thunder and the bolts of lightning and suddenly thinks, there must be something beyond this. How did a savage hit upon the idea that he might have a soul? Well, some man goes down to the river to draw the water. He looks into the water, and lo and behold, there's something staring back at him, his own reflection. He's not bright enough to recognize that it's his reflection, but he sees that it is somehow connected with him as he moves his head and his arms and his hands, and therefore he came up with the idea that he has a soul. Or a woman might have a dream one night. In this dream, she sees her dead granny, who reaches out to her and gives her something lovely to eat. And because of that dream, the idea of a soul that has gone on to a heaven was born. The idea behind all of this was, according to 19th century Victorian era anthropologists, that savages lived in a compressed mentality, which basically meant they could not distinguish between various kinds of reality. Dream reality, daydreaming reality, and waking reality were all one thing, and they could not distinguish clearly and easily between them. In France, Lévi-Bruhl put forward the idea that primitives had a childish mentality. By this he meant that they reasoned in the way that perhaps a 7 or an 8-year-old might reason. It was a type of reasoning, but it was very different from the educated Victorian English way of reasoning about the world. These ideas held sway for a number of decades, but were eventually debunked and defrocked and cast aside, I think principally by the work of Sir Edward Everett Evans Pritchard. In his pioneering study, Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic among the Azandi, he went to one of these primitive societies and studied witchcraft. But instead of witchcraft being a thing of hocus pocus, Evans Pritchard portrayed it as a logical system of thought to explain extraordinary misfortune. For the Azandi, everybody is born with witchcraft. It's actually seated above the large intestine, a little black thing they call mangu. The point of witchcraft is to kill others. Somehow, consciously or unconsciously, this mangu substance can leave the body, take flight at night, and then attach itself to another human being for a while and begin to gobble away the soul substance. It takes quite a bit of time before the soul substance is gone, but as the soul substance goes, a person weakens, sickens, and eventually dies. But it is a power that all human beings possess. This means then, as Evan Pritchard puts it, that when something extraordinary happens to us, we begin to suspect witchcraft. if I am a typical Zandi man who's walked through the forest 1,000,000 times and I bark my shin on a tree and it bleeds, I have the expectation that that wound will heal within a week and I'll be fine. But what happens now if it's 3 weeks on and it's still bleeding and oozing pus? This is something extraordinary, and I begin to explain it in light of witchcraft. And by so doing, then, I know how to deal with the problem and how to get myself well. So Evans Pritchard presents the Azandi as people who reason as logically as any Europeans. It is only that the premises of their system of thinking are very different from our own. And as he would say, they were wrong. The Zandi were wrong. Their premises were incorrect. About 3 decades later, a man in England named Peter Winch asked a very interesting question in a critique of Evans Pritchard's work, which was, how can we really know for certain that witchcraft powers do not exist? His conclusion was that we can't. There is no way empirically to prove that witchcraft exists or does not exist. So upon which basis do we say that it does not exist? Witchcraft simply is. This is a very interesting thing to consider about our human imaginary worlds. Most of the ideas in there are not capable of being proven true or false. Let us think for a moment of priesthood power. Suppose so-and-so is ill and has a blessing and feels that priesthood power was involved in healing. Can we prove that priesthood power was not involved? Can we conclusively prove that it was involved? For those who live in that imaginary world, it is real. This was Peter Winch's argument. For those who do not live in that world, it may not be real, but we cannot prove that it does not exist. Strangely enough, these days, those whom 19th century gentlemen called savages are actually critiquing our thought, our imaginary worlds, our ways of organizing life, and finding them incomprehensible and inhuman. Books such as Things Fall Apart and The Ambiguous Adventure are quite brilliant reversals of the Victorian age paradigm. So that's a bit on history. Now let's move into the question of the structure of a human imaginary world. What is a paradigm or a worldview or a cultural world or an imaginary world? These are all terms that basically refer to the same sort of thing. Well, it takes a while to figure out and to understand what this means, but I will say that the imaginary world is our world. It is a human world. It is the totalizing intellectual world in which we live. It contains all of the ideas about the nature of reality that we have come to accept as true. All of the ideas we use to interpret what is going on around us, to guide our actions. The ideas we use to reflect on things, to make decisions about what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong. The ideas we use to order a household, to determine what is beautiful and what is not, and so forth. These ideas are read into the world. They are not read out of the world. It is a projection that we, living in a human imaginary world, place upon the world so that the world appears to us to be this way. And as I've already mentioned, it contains those worlds, ideas, as Winch has said, ideas whose ultimate truth or falsity is empirically indeterminate. Now let's think about this with another example. Perhaps most of us here accept the idea that Joseph Smith had a first vision. Is it possible for us to conclusively prove in an empirical sense that he had a vision? Is it possible for us to prove that he did not have a vision? This is what ideas in our imaginary worlds are like. They simply are. most of them are completely incapable of being proven conclusively true or conclusively false. This will eventually feed into the third element of my talk on how we come to know things to be true. Let's move back now to the idea of how these ideas in our imaginary world are organized. We know that there is some minimal standard of coherence among the many ideas that comprise our imaginary world. It could be hundreds or thousands of ideas. But how are they organized? In a moment of Aristotelian rapture, Iris Murdoch observed that our mind is naturally one-making. An idea that somehow our minds, whatever our mind actually is, generates the impression that there is a general coherence among the ideas of our imaginary world. Somehow these disparate and sundry ideas are seen to somehow cohere. If our thoughts and ideas about the nature of things are somehow organized, what is that structure? It's a very difficult question to answer. But what is the mind's template for organizing these ideas? If we look at the works of Emil Durkheim, a sociologist of the late 19th and early 20th century, he has a solution to this. He believes that basically everything in human life has a social origin. Eventually that idea becomes oxymoronic, but this is what he meant. Somehow the structure or the organization of our society eventually works its way on our minds so that it becomes the organizing template we use for categorizing the rest of the world. So, for instance, if we were Australian Aborigines and we lived in a society of 12 tribes, somehow that number 12 would be very important. Our minds would over time pick it up. And not only would our society be organized according to 12 tribes, the animal world would be divided into 12 sections. The plant world would be divided into 12 sections. Somehow, instead of 4 cardinal directions, we would invent 12 directions. Our whole world then would be organized in a fashion after the organization of our society. And it is through growing up in such a social structure that our minds more or less unconsciously absorb that structure, and then we begin to use it, quite unaware of the fact that we have absorbed it and are using it, because it seems so self-evident to us. The Durkheimian idea has had a great impact on anthropology. People still use this idea. I myself find it not very useful, not very true to life, but it is one attempt to understand what the organization of the ideas of our imaginary world might look like. A successor to Durkheim many decades, well not many, but several decades later, Lévi-Strauss, had a similar idea, but it was actually opposite. Things do not have a social origin. Things have an origin in the mind itself. For Lévi-Strauss, the idea was that somehow as human beings evolved, our minds looked at the world and began to notice connections between things. Connections that might not really exist, but connections that our mind itself began to force upon the world. Chief among which is binary opposition, that the world actually partakes of binary opposition. So we have light and dark, male and female, up and down, and so on and so forth. But somehow, in our interaction with the world, our mind is stimulated to begin to see a pattern, some kind of organization in the natural world. This impresses itself upon our mind, and then becomes the organizing template for our social worlds. I don't think that Lévi-Strauss's ideas have had quite the longevity of Durkheim's. I had a flirtation with it for quite a number of years, and I still enjoy that flirtation from time to time, but ultimately I am not convinced by it. It seems to me that these ideas are too simplistic, that our minds are far more complex than any Durkheimian paradigm or Lévi-Straussian model could possibly present. So let's move on and think a bit about this. And now we're getting into the idiosyncrasies. Let's think for a moment about an imaginary world. What is it in human beings that allows us to actually have and live in an imaginary world? So I think if we can understand something about that, we have a better chance of understanding something about the organization of that world. We'll turn to the work of the German philosopher Ernst Cassirer. His ideas on this subject, I think, are fruitful and useful for us to contemplate. For Cassirer, one of the principal attributes of the human mind that separates us from all other living creatures is abstraction, the ability to abstract. Now, what does this word mean? To abstract obviously means to remove from. When he uses this word, what he means is that human beings have the ability to remove ourselves from our concrete context, at least in our minds. I'll give you an example of this. Most of you here who are uninterested in this talk, which is probably all of you, your minds are 1,000,000 miles away. You're thinking about something you did last summer, anticipating some grungy meal at 5 o'clock in the Cougar Eat. But how can you do this if you are stuck in this present concrete context of the here and now? Well, somehow our mind is able to do this. It can transport us backwards and forwards in time and space. This, according to Cassirer, is an attribute that only human beings have. Animals do not have this ability. I'm always very skeptical of studies of animals. We look at Jane Goodall, these chimps are human beings. And we look at other studies of animals, and they are just the brute, dumbest creatures on earth. So I remain a bit skeptical on this, but we will follow the logical reasoning here of Cassirer as we look at an animal world. Well, how is the world experienced by a dog? We don't know. But according to many researchers, says Cassirer, dogs do not have the ability to abstract themselves from their concrete context and move in their minds forward and backwards across time and space. Dogs react to signs and signals. So if we go to the example everybody knows of Pavlov and his mutt, the bell rings, the dog salivates and wants food because it has associated that bell ringing with food. Now, what this means is that the dog has been able to associate ringing with food. It does not mean that the dog can abstract itself from its present circumstance and think, gee, 2 weeks ago they gave me a really good meal. I wonder what's on for tonight. The dog can remember, but according to Cassirer, animals live in a world of discrete events. Whereas human beings are able to move forwards and backwards in time and link together great chains of events, animals cannot do that. Each event is experienced as a discrete event and cannot be thought about again. So the dog is able to react to the bell and expect food, but cannot remember anything about its previous meals, whether they were nice or not. Would, I suppose, be something like us approaching a stop sign. the stop sign immediately triggers a reaction in us. We have to stop. If we were stuck in an animal world, we would never be able to think about the last time we stopped at this stop sign and remember that the cop was over there, so we have to be very sure that we stop properly, or that we once ran a stop sign and broadsided somebody. No, it would be, I see the stop sign, I stop, without being able to link that event to any other past event. Now, it is because of our ability to abstract that we are able to use symbols and to speak a language, according to Casseret. Our imaginary worlds are really compilations of ideas that we link together. And it's interesting how we can apply these ideas across space and time just so easily. As I stand here, I can recall the events of my childhood, and I can bring them into my immediate presence, or into present time. I can also think of people I have met in the past whom I hope never to meet again, and I can imagine them lingering outside my office door, and I can even think of scenarios of how to avoid having to see them, simply because I can abstract myself from this concrete context and think about things across time and space. It is remarkable that we can move seamlessly over time and over space. And it's a capacity that we take so for granted, we hardly ever think about it. But it's a very important capacity if we are to understand something about the nature of our imaginary worlds. It seems to me that this innate capacity, which we also link to language, is one that awakens slowly over time. Casseret uses the example of Helen Keller, a particular event from her life, to illustrate this idea. Most of us know Helen Keller, if only from the Helen Keller jokes of my generation. But Helen Keller was a woman, a very intelligent woman. She was around 2 years old when she was struck with an illness. I don't remember, I believe it was meningitis. But at the end of this illness, she was left blind and deaf. Well, let's think about this. At the age of 2, what kind of a language capacity does a child have? Some, but not much. We see as a child develops, a child learns how to use present tense. But it takes a while for a child to be able to use past tense and then future tense, because these symbolic abilities awaken over time. Well, all of you probably know the story of Helen Keller, how her parents hired a woman called Anne Sullivan to come and work with her. And we've probably seen the play of Helen Keller ranging around the dinner table, pulling things off of plates, being really quite a beastly child. But one of the things that Anne Sullivan attempted to do with Helen Keller was teach her a sign language, this kind of thing where they do the signs on the palm so it can be read that way. Well, it seems that for months and months and months and months and months, Anne Sullivan had been signing these things into Helen's hand. Water, milk, pitcher, horse, porch, broom. They didn't mean much to Helen. I'm going to read an excerpt from a letter that Anne Sullivan wrote a friend. Helen has learned that everything has a name and that the manual alphabet is the key to everything she wants to know. This morning, while she was washing, she wanted to know the name for water. When she wants to know the name of anything, she points to it and pats my hand, and I spell W-A-T-E-R. I spelled it and thought no more about it until after breakfast. Later on, we went out to the pump house, and I made Helen hold her mug under the spout while I pumped. As the cold water gushed forth, filling the mug, I spelled W-A-T-E-R in Helen's free hand. The word coming so close upon the sensation of cold water running over her hand seemed to startle her. She dropped the mug and stood transfixed. A new light came into her face. She spelled water several times. Then she dropped on the ground and asked for its name and pointed to the pump and the trellis, and suddenly turning around, she asked for my name. Now, what was this event about? According to Casseret, at this point in time, Helen Keller was able to draw upon the principle of abstraction and to be able to use symbols and to understand that W-A-T-E-R was not a discrete event, that it stood for water at any point in time and space. This transformation that happened so easily to children was quite dramatic in Helen's life because it happened as she was an older child, but it did, in fact, change her world. This is an interesting and prominent feature of our imaginary worlds, that our ideas are, that the ideas we have, we can transport across time and space. Well, if Thomas Kuhn is correct, and I think there is some reason to consider that he might be correct, that our lives are always lived within a paradigm, that we may switch from one imaginary world or one paradigm to another, but we cannot live in the absence of one. We come to realize that these paradigms are deeply seated. They are truly a part of us. The ideas that we come to accept over our early childhood and youth as being true and correct, those are ideas that stay with us for our lives most often. We have a relationship with those ideas that changes over time. The way we used to think about a particular thing may not be the way we think about it now. These imaginary worlds are so deeply seated in us that it would be hard for us to even conceive of what it would be like to live in the absence of such an imaginary world. Now, we move on to the question of how are the ideas of an imaginary world structured or placed together? This I don't know, but there are a few obvious facts about these ideas. The first is that not all ideas are of equal value. Some ideas in an imaginary world are far more important than others. And it seems that there will always be a core of ideas upon which everything else is founded. For instance, a question I often ask students when trying to illustrate this point is, within Mormonism, what is the most fundamental idea? Most people say restoration by Joseph Smith, Jesus as atoner and savior. But this isn't quite right, is it? The most fundamental idea in Mormonism would have to be that God exists, because as an idea it is logically prior to any other. So we know that in the structure of an imaginary world, some ideas are weightier than others, and that there must be some sort of a logical progression among at least some of those ideas. Certainly not all of them, but some of those ideas. I have an overhead here. It's a crude overhead, but it is a poor attempt to illustrate this idea. That here we have a plane, and from it springing a few core ideas, but as they branch out, other things grow on them, and that these branches mingle and mix, but it's never a static kind of structure. It seems to me that our minds are constantly moving and changing, and the interconnections between ideas can be drastically rearranged depending on our experience. Okay, you may turn that off. Thank you. I offer that, and that's about as far as I can go into what this structure might actually look like. But I think it presents some very interesting and perplexing questions. As I mentioned, I don't think that the structure could be static, because as we encounter new ideas and need to resolve issues that we cannot resolve at the moment, we probably rearrange things and we draw connections between things. We attempt to stretch our imaginary world and pull it and tug it in this way and in that way. I think we've all been party to very strained analogies, but these strained analogies are really part and parcel of the way we human beings think, because somehow we want the elements of our conscious life to fit together, even if it fits together in a very uneasy way. Somehow, in most of our experience, we are able to resolve things within our paradigm, to stretch, to rethink, to fit things together in an uneasy way that gives us, I guess, a bit of a resolution. Because of this, I think in the past year or so, I have become more convinced than ever that contradictions and paradoxes do not really exist. They only arise as we look at somebody else's thought, somebody else's imaginary world, from a different imaginary world. Because we want to avoid these contradictions and these paradoxes at all cost. And I don't imagine that most of us would be able to think of anything in our imaginary worlds that we would consider truly contradictory or truly paradoxical. I'll give you an example of this from the world of evolution. When it comes to matching theory with data, evolution is a very poor theory. Stephen Jay Gould recognized this in the fossil record, because evolution would tell us that species evolve at a glacial pace over enormous periods of time. Well, how do evolutionists then deal with the fact that the fossil record sometimes shows a species not changing for eons and then boom, in the next layer above it, a completely different creature? This bothered Stephen Jay Gould, who of course was at his time the high priest and grand master, I think, of evolution. He passed away a couple of years ago. But he created an idea called punctuated equilibrium. This means that in a very short amount of time, an enormous amount of evolution can occur. Well, this seems to go against basic ideas of evolution. But he wanted to resolve the difficulties that the fossil record implied within his own imaginary world. And he did it through this particular idea. It is a very uneasy wedding together of ideas. It is a great stretching, perhaps to the breaking point of a particular paradigm. But he did not want the contradiction or the paradox to exist in his imaginary world. This is why I think that paradoxes and contradictions really do not exist within an imaginary world. As I've said, they are products of people looking from the outside, ensconced in another imaginary world. It's not something that we would necessarily or obviously see. In a manner of speaking, then, an imaginary world has life within us. Our relationship with it, as I have mentioned, changes. It often deepens over the course of a lifetime. Our understanding of the particular ideas of that imaginary world change considerably over time. And over time it becomes so deeply a part of us that we as conscious human beings cannot separate ourselves from our imaginary worlds. In a practical sense, we really cannot separate ourselves from an imaginary world. There is no other world for us. Now we move on to part 3. This, I think, is the most interesting part. How is it that we human beings come to know the ideas of our imaginary worlds to be true? Those of us who have crossed the globe in doing field work, and even those of us who have not, but have talked to another person who has a very different understanding of the nature of things, cannot help but be struck at the confidence that people have in the correctness of their ideas. Well, how do we gain that confidence in our ideas? If we look to anthropology, we, I think, are deeply led astray. In anthropology, it is always ritual. We move people through a ritual, and in the course of that ritual, they come to know things to be true. This is a Durkheimian idea that has circulated throughout the decades and is still alive and kicking. We read it in Geertz. It may be in his very pretty prose, but it's still a stupid idea. Geertz's famous article, Religion as a Cultural System, doesn't offer one shred of evidence. There is not one informant who says, yes, I participated in that ritual and now I know these things to be true. It is this great anthropological hoax that if we march through ritual, we now know. As you can see, I'm down on that idea because I don't see any evidence of it. I don't see any evidence of it in the people I study in southwestern Africa. So how do we become convinced that our ideas about the fundamental nature of the world are true? As I study and think about this, and I have particularly studied this among the Himba, and I have asked them, I have not assumed that we march through ritual A and we are now converts. The answers are really very startling. Answers such as, I just know it. One day I understood these things and I know that they're right. What this does is it bespeaks some kind of a deep internal experience. Remember that ritual is external manipulation. It is an attempt to force something from the outside into us. And maybe there are people who come to know things to be true through participating in a ritual, but I think the vast majority of people do not. They come to know these things in the kind of epiphaneic experience that Kierkegaard describes as a deeply internal experience, something that happens once in a great while. It is a moment of brilliant clarity when, because we can abstract ourselves from time and space, our mind recedes from the world for just an instant and we see things that we had not seen before. What we have been taught or thought all along now becomes clear to us, but it becomes clear in a very powerfully persuasive way. I have notes that could go on for about an hour and a half, but my time is basically up, and I will have to leave it at that. But I think I will close this talk by saying that I have found myself that this is a very fruitful area of research, primarily because nobody else is particularly interested in doing it. And as I have researched in this, I think I have gained a much greater appreciation of the human being and the kind of worlds that we create and the great fragility of those worlds. We do, in fact, as we are taught in the scriptures, we live by faith. There is no empirical balance in the sky that we can weigh and truly know particular ideas to be absolutely true in a scientific or empirical sense. And yet we as human beings know all kinds of things to be true. We know them, I think, because of these epiphaneic experiences, and we are anchored to them through these experiences. And that's it.